This is the final word. Not the final word, anything else, just the final word. The one-time, middle of the week, long show as opposed to all of the other shows that we are currently doing. Geoff Lemon and Adam Collins. And this week we are doing something we have done for the last 3 years. Well, this is the third year, so for the last 2 years, a tradition now, which is going through the new Wisden Almanack, the good book, sitting down with the editor, Lawrence Booth, for a good chunk of his time and asking him, what's in the book? What have you put in the book? Normally, it's cricket, but in a year when there was not necessarily a lot of cricket, it was other things as well. All of that will come. Good things come to those who wait. Adam, you are at home with a sick and unhappy baby who may be part of the sonic landscape of this show as we go on, and you may feel like crying as well.
Yes, Geoff, I can guarantee that Winnie will be part of this show. There's no doubting that. The hotbed of germs that is nursery. This is the first time she's been ill there in 2 weeks, which might be an achievement given she's not seen a lot of babies since getting back from Australia. But it's okay. She's in good spirits still. She's crying occasionally. She wants her mummy. She wants to suck on her thumb, and she wants to, just generally speaking, just wants to be held, and don't we all at one level? So I'm happy to oblige, but at the moment, she just wants to be loved. So that's okay. We'll get through it.
Good stuff. You've been doing county championship commentary. I spent the weekend doing something, a childhood dream realised, commentating the Mercantile Mutual Cup, or whatever it's called now. I actually got the chance to go through on air a discussion of all of the different things that it's been called over the period of time. Got almost all of them from memory, which I was pretty happy about. But it wasn't very exceptional. Not much to write home about. A real sort of 1993 style 50 over game of 250, good score batting first, grind them out 5 and over. That's a big ask. So probably not much point going through the game itself, but New South Wales won that.
It felt like the most noteworthy thing that was that Western Australia were in the final. I mean, this time last week when talking about the machinations, it felt like Queensland were a dead cert unless WA got a double bonus point win over Tasmania, and they hit in excess of 300 and bowled out Tassie for 140 to get themselves into that position. So, but they couldn't repeat the dose, and New South Wales win the domestic one-day comp, the Mercantile Mutual Cup, for the 12th time, I think it was.
So it's an interesting development that has come to our attention. Peter English, who a lot of people would remember the name, they'd think that sounds familiar because Pete for a long time was ESPN Cricinfo's Australian correspondent. Left that job, went into academia. He's working with the Sunshine Coast University, and he's doing a survey about podcast audiences, and he wants to know about the Final Words podcast audience. So if you're listening to this show or watching this show on YouTube, you still count. It doesn't matter if it's a video or an audio format, but he wants to know about the audience, and so he has developed a survey where he wants to ask you questions. Firstly, your credit card number. Secondly, your date of birth. There's a range of academic related questions about podcast audiences, so the link for that will be in the show notes, and if you want to do that survey for Pete, he'd be very grateful.
10 to 15 minutes. I caught up with Pete when we were on the Sunshine Coast during the Australian summer, and he said he had an interest in learning more about podcast audiences, and he identified our show as one that was of particular interest to him. So with his background in cricket, it's all pretty straightforward there. 10 to 15 minutes. We've had a look over it. There's no curly ones there. It should be all at the front there with the legality of it all. You sign away your life. No, not really. You just say that you're happy for your responses to be included in the academic research. All anonymous, of course. And you'd be doing a favour to a friend of ours, Pete English, who did such fine work back in the day with Cricinfo, the role that Dan Bredig does these days, who you'd know well if you've listened to this show over a long period of time. So all down underneath in the show notes from the Sunshine Coast University academic Pete English. And play along, be involved in the survey.
The county championship, Adam, you were there pretty much freezing to death on that weekend. We saw the pictures from Headingley of the snow, the match that got snowed off, which is unusual, you'd have to say, for what is notionally a summer sport. Were you outdoors doing commentary on the Middlesex game at Lord's?
It wasn't so much that we were outdoors. We were indoors in the tavern stand, but we had to have our doors open, which we may as well have been outdoors. And at the end of a 2-hour session, when it's sort of I don't know, 3 or 4 degrees outside. Stevie Eskenazi, the captain of Middlesex, said it's the coldest he's ever batted in. And I can't believe Jack Leach was able to bowl as effectively as he was, with fingers that must have been frozen through. He was blowing on them every ball, but it couldn't have made much of a difference. And in the end, Leach played a massive role in turning that game around. It was an extraordinary game of cricket to watch first up. So day one, Middlesex make in excess of 300. Robson makes 165. And then Somerset at one point are 9 for 89. They're 224 runs behind, about to follow on. They put on 83 for the 10th wicket. They end up passing the follow-on mark, bowling out Middlesex for 140 in the second dig, and chasing down 285. So a classic come-from-behind effort for them there in the freezing cold at Lords. But, yeah, it was beautiful to have cricket back early April, all the rest of it. As you say, the snow stopping play in Yorkshire. It felt a long way from home, Toto.
Well, I hope that things improve slightly for you. We were very comfortable at Bankstown Oval, which was interesting seeing the honour boards up there. A lot of familiar names, 3 different War brothers, Nathan Bracken, Kevin Roberts, Lenny Pascoe, Geoff Thompson, etc., who graced the Bankstown Club over the years, and it was nice of them to have us. Importantly, in that first county round, Darren Stevens, a couple of weeks away from his 45th birthday, made another first-class century, a player who will be discussed later on in the show with Lawrence Booth for other reasons, but made that 100, and for that reason would have to be our CBUS Super Performer of the Week.
I couldn't agree more. Don't throw away your innings in retirement. Visit cbussuper.com.au/thefinalword. Get all the information you need about getting your super sorted out, and you can get a product disclosure statement in any format you like from there, and you'll know that past performance is no reliable indicator of future performance. I suppose, though, with Darren Stevens, it very much is as you say, into his 4th decade of first-class cricket, and the 4th decade where he's been able to make a century, which is just incredible when you consider that he started off as a batsman, then a batting all-rounder, then a bowling all-rounder, then a frontline bowler, and now kind of a bowling all-rounder again down there at Canterbury. One of a number of standout performances. James Vince made it 231 at better than a run a ball. And final word favourite, Geoff, I thought you'd like to know that Reece Topley took 5 wickets for Surrey, leading the attack in what ended up being an unfortunate result for Surrey, but over at Bristol, but a great start to the season for the big left armour.
Someone who can only be described as a big unit. There is no other way, no other legal way to describe Reece Topley. The IPL is up and about as well. 4 games done at the time of recording, probably 5 or 6 by the time this episode goes out. We're doing a bit on that with the final word on the YouTube channel. It's not necessarily on the podcast feed because they're shorter, quick grab shows. So we're doing what we're calling the speed round twice a week, which is Mondays and Fridays most likely, which is a wrap-up of not of the games per se, but of bits that have caught our eye, things that we've found interesting or amusing. We're also catching up with Glenn Maxwell on a roughly weekly basis to find out what's going on over in India with the live crosses to the Bubble Hotel. And we'll be doing some other bits and pieces when we can, maybe some live watch-along stuff, some a few little match wraps here and there if and when we get time to do it. So if you're IPL enthused, head to the Final Word Cricket Podcast channel on YouTube.
I think we're committed to the live watch-along. I'm keen to do it. Wednesday, you and me, Geoff. It'll be the Sunrisers of Hyderabad against the Royal Challengers of Bangalore. So Warner against Maxwell is another way of interpreting that contest. And Maxie was brilliant last week.
It'll be about 2 hours after this podcast goes up, maybe, or unless I'm getting the time zone wrong. Because I think, no, the pod's getting launched British time, so actually it'll be over by the time this podcast goes
okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. You can rewatch it back on YouTube. That didn't quite work out. We have an embargo to honour with Wisden Almanack, of course, that goes out at the same time. So we're recording this a couple of days before it actually will go out. There you go. One other bit about the IPL which didn't make our speed round. It's the London Mayoral election at the moment, and you know my history or my background in politics, I always like to look through the various promises that candidates are issuing. And Sadiq Khan, who's the incumbent Labor mayor, has been talking about bringing the IPL to London, which I thought was noteworthy. Probably not going to make it into our speed round, but he says that conversations between Surrey and his organisation, Greater London, and the IPL have started. So it might be the case that I suppose they play NFL games in London. They bring them over for a couple of weeks, and we've seen those sort of exhibition games. But imagine that. Imagine a couple of IPL games being played at the Oval and Lords at some point in the future. It'd be wild.
I'm just thinking of those times when it would be Essendon playing the Demons in San Diego or whatever. Who's going to put on an exhibition game in the USA? I suppose people actually already like cricket in England, so it's an easier sell.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't think of this when we were in Canberra. We didn't promise to bring the IPL to Australia or something like that. And speaking of exhibition games, by the way, the Mr. Sheffield final is this weekend between Queensland and New South Wales at AB Field. I note on that, by the way, that the UK clearly didn't get the nanny in the 90s, because I've received a number of messages and a very confused look by my girlfriend, who's like, what on earth are you two blokes talking about, when listening to the podcast back the other day? And I'm like, the nanny, Fran Drescher. She's like, I have no idea what you're on about. And upon Googling it, a couple of messages on Twitter, it must have been one of those American programs that got picked up with enthusiasm in Australia, but not in the UK. So... but I gather it is coming to one of the streaming services soon from Googling it last night. So it might be the case that if you're in the UK, you can know what we're talking about when we talk about the Mr. Sheffield Shield and its conclusion this weekend with a lot of Test players playing.
Look forward to it to becoming a cult hit with, you sort of talk about cricket hipster internet. Through that, a really niche bunch of people will get really into the nanny. Say 15 years later or 25 years later or whatever it might be, they'll start watching it from the start, and it'll be like those people who just discovered Breaking Bad or whatever. Oh my God, this show's fantastic.
Maybe we should do I know we've talked about doing a recap podcast of Sliders, but if it gets really big, an episode recap podcast of the nanny, it might happen. It's you and I. Anything's possible.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I remember when the actor who played Gracie popped up on Californication with David Duchovny. It was an extremely confusing time. I did not enjoy that experience. Nothing felt right about it. So that's where we're at with all of those things. I think this week we want to just plough into this interview because we've just finished speaking to Lawrence. It's a fascinating walk through everything that's happened over the last year. So we probably just need to play a quick little game and then get into it. What do you reckon?
Let's do that.
We'll play a little bit of a Nerd Pledge. The game that we play with people on our Patreon page who quiz us. The reverse quiz. Unlike other shows that like to quiz the audience quizzes us. They send us a number, and that number is via an amount of money. To be frank, it's something that helps support the show, but it also relates to cricket in some way, and we have to guess what the number is. Before we do that, I have to make good on a promise I made last week that I didn't make good on. Yes,
so we received a message on social media from Chris March, who wants to know more about your music festival story from last week that you teased us with in the intro and never went on to explain. So, and I think, as you say, it's got a Nerd Pledge link.
It does. And probably in retrospect, it's not a story that really it will survive well having to wait for a week. It's not that good a story. Like it's okay. But I was at a music festival. It was maybe, I don't know, heading late into the evening, and I was walking through a crowd of people, and somebody called my name and said, "Geoff." That's my name, if you don't know, if you're just listening to this for the first time. And I said, yes. And this gentleman said, you will not know who I am, but I know who you are. And I said, okay, right. And he said, my name is Kieran Barnes-Jenkins. And I said, you are not as good a leg spinner as Cameron White. And it was a real nothing but net feeling, because like weeks earlier on the show we discussed a Nerd Pledge from Kieran Barnes-Jenkins which had that relationship to Cameron White, the Victorian leg spinner, and somehow despite having had an incident, this was only night one of the festival, and I'd already managed an incident where I got the water bottle, filled it up with ice and topped it up with water, and then realised it was the one that had been mostly full of whiskey that I'd brought in, for the cold nights, and then realised that I had no choice but to finish it because otherwise it was going to be ruined. It would only be good while the ice was cold. So that had already happened on night one. And yet in that moment, I was still able to recall the nerd pledge, the number and the answer and who it belonged to. And it felt like a great achievement at the time.
Outstanding. Thank you, KBJ, who I know from my former life, and for supporting the show on Nerd Pledge. All the better for it. Geoff, we have 2 numbers up today.
That's right. The first of those comes from Hugh Moorhead. It is in pounds. It's £7.28. And so if you don't understand the rules of Nerd Pledge, it means that 7 to 8 in some way, there could be a decimal point in there, there might not be, but 7 to 8 in some way has to relate to cricket in a way that Hugh has found meaningful, and we've got to work out what it means. So 7 to 8 in sequence, what might that suggest to you, Adam Collins?
Well, Geoff, it's been taken twice in Test cricket, and I was only going to mention one, but I saw these lovely links between the two, and I thought I'll bring them all together because it relates to our home ground, the Melbourne Cricket Ground. So we'll start with the second, which was Hugh Trumbull. He took 7 for 28 against England at the G in 1904. In England's first innings of 61, he didn't even get a bowl. Noble 4 for 19, Timmy Cotter 6 for 40, and Hugh Trumbull was sort of left on the bench. But in the second dig, when they were chasing 320 and were all out for 101, he did get on and bowled 6.5 overs and took 7 for 28. So it was busy, lots of runs and lots of wickets. And
are those 8-ball overs?
No. This was 6-ball overs by 1904.
6-ball overs.
So and that included a hat trick. So he picks up Bosey, Plum Warner, and Dick Lilly, leg before for the third wicket. It was his second hat trick as well, having taken one in the corresponding fixture against England on the same ground, the MCG, back in 1902. So one of 2 Trumbull hat tricks at the G, and in the second of those, the figures are incredible because, as I say, he doesn't bowl in the first dig, and then the second time around, yeah, they're chasing heaps, but he doesn't bowl until deep into the innings and then goes on to only get 6.5 overs. But, gee, he made them count.
So 41 deliveries.
Yeah.
You know, excluding if there were some extras. In 41 balls, 7 of them were wickets, leaving him 34 other balls, which conceded 28 runs. So they weren't holding back against him, when he wasn't taking wickets. And then as far as the names of those dismissed, like what great names. Bernard Bosanquet, Plum Warner, and the penis flower himself, Dick Lilly. Yeah,
it's a memorable analysis. 7 for 28. No maidens, of course, there. So, and the reverse is true of the second 7 for 28, where there are a lot of maidens. So this is 9 years earlier. The first time those figures were taken were by a tragic figure in the game, it must be said, Billy Bates, who was another off-spinner, who in this test match in 1893 at the MCG again, England make 294, Australia all out for 114. And the great Yorkshireman Billy Bates comes on third change and takes 7 for 28 from 26.2 overs. So very economical along the way. And it included the first test hat trick for any Englishman. And the second ever in tests, of course. Fred Spofforth took the first one, and the first for England and the second of all time was Billy Bates in his 7 for 28 on the same ground where Hugh Trumbull would take his second hat trick some 11 years later. But yes, in his case, it was Percy McDonald, George Giffen and George Bonner, who were batsmen 5, 6 and 7. And then in the second innings, he picks up 7 for 74. So 7 for 28 with a hat trick the first time around. 7 for 74 in the second to give him match figures of 14 for 102. And that was the first 10-wicket match in Test match history. So by definition, the best figures ever taken. No one had ever taken 10, and he sort of smashed that world record Usain Bolt style and took 14 for his trouble, 14 for 102. Also made a half century with the bat. So it really is one of the all-time great individual performances. It stacks up to this very day. And it went on to be the first ever innings victory in Test cricket as well, with England beating Australia by an innings and heaps there at the G in 1883. I said it was 10 years before. It wasn't 11 years before. It was 21 years before the Trumbull time. But yeah, I mentioned it's a tragic story, Billy Bates, and on another Australian tour 4 years later, 1887-88. We've talked about this briefly on Storytime in the past. He was bowling in the nets and a straight drive was hit back at him, smashed him in the eye, and he could no longer see, and in turn he never bowled again. He attempted to kill himself on the way back to England on the ship, unsuccessfully, but he eventually died. Depression set in, and he passed away at age 44 in 1900.
Jesus.
All up, he played 15 test matches. All of them were in Australia, which is still the record for an English player in terms of away versus home. A player never having turned out at home, but that's the most that someone's played away. And in those 15 test matches, he took 50 wickets at 16.4, with that famous best bowling of 7 for 28, the second hat-trick of all time, the first for England, Billy Bates.
You've taken me on a journey, Adam. So the lesson is, if you take 7 for 28, you will get a hat trick. That's just how it is.
Especially at the G.
Salute to Billy Bates, and fitting on a show where we'll talk a fair bit about cricket history. The other number is from Sami Dowd, a long-time supporter of the show, a loyalist in the ranks of the final word. $2.78 is the number, and I have no doubt, Adam, that if you were doing this number, you would have gone to the history of Errol Holmes, 278th Test player for England, who played 5 tests as a batsman, averaging 16 and took 2 wickets, but was apparently very good at the level below that, and what a great name as well. Errol Holmes, prominent as a board member or administrator with the MCC and with Surrey Cricket Club, which is a strange double. But I think we know what this one is. I think we know what, if we look at it as a score, 278. People who've made this score in first-class cricket include A.B. de Villiers, Don Bradman, V.J. Merchant, Dennis Compton, and your favourite Sanjay Manjrekar. But somebody else made 278 batting at first drop in first-class cricket. You know who it is, don't you? You know who it is. Isn't it tickling somewhere? Who made 278?
I'm under the pump here.
Facing 318 balls at the North Sydney Oval.
At 278 at North Sydney Oval, facing 318 balls. I feel very
cruising
much
to a triple ton and didn't
under
quite
the
get
cosh.
there, but a great day, a great, exciting day. You and I were both following this innings very closely.
This isn't the Dominic Thornley one, because he was short of 278.
No.
Who made 278? I'm padding now because I'm having that horrible moment where it's obviously an innings I know, but I can't quite.
It is.
Pluck it. How long ago are we talking?
Within the last 5 or 6 years. So this person may be currently employed by the Final Word Cricket Podcast in some capacity.
Right. Okay. First, okay. Christ. Sorry, Maxie. Fuck. Yes, Glenn Maxwell's ridiculous innings to start his... well, not to start his campaign. He was already playing for Victoria at the start of the season, but he was. It was the day before, wasn't it, that he was with the Test squad as injury cover for Sean Marsh. They released him to play in the Shield round. Went down to North Sydney Oval and played against an international quality attack, which from memory included Doug Bollinger, Steve O'Keefe, Trent Copeland, and one other. But I know all the bowlers had played Test cricket. And he pantsed them.
Yep. He hit 36 fours and 4 sixes at North Sydney Oval, and basically just got out when he got bored, having been out there for so long. So, yes, Glenn James Maxwell, his highest score in first-class cricket for Victoria at 278. That's got to be it. Sammy's last number was Dean Jones adjacent, so there's no way that this number is not Glenn Maxwell adjacent.
Thank you, Sammy, and thank you for our first nerd pledger this week, which was Hugh Moorhead, and thank you to Kieran Barnes-Jenkins for tapping Geoff on the shoulder. Nice way to start our nerd pledge segment. Geoff, we're ready to take a break, aren't we? Which we'll do now, and when we return, we'll be back with the editor of the Wisden Cricketers Almanack, Lawrence Booth. It's the Zoleo.
Zoleo, the magic box that could save your life or could just enable you to send a long description of a sunset to somebody who wants it. We were just talking about Sean Marsh a moment ago, whose nickname was often SOS, S-O-S, and as you can see on the video there, SOS is written into the Zoleo. A little box
meant to be.
Taps into the world's satellite communications network and lets you do a couple of things. One of them is that it turns your regular smartphone into a satellite phone for the purposes of textual communications, emails and SMSs. So you can be anywhere in the world, on any mountain, on any lifeboat, forge every stream, ford every stream. I'm not sure what you do. I suppose you ford it, climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every rainbow. Whatever you're doing, you can text or email anyone on your phone with your Zoleo. And the other thing you can do is use that little SOS hatch, open it up, see the red button. Everyone wants to press a red button. It's there to press. If you press it, someone will come and rescue you. They will know exactly where you are, down to the minutes and the seconds, the GPS coordinates, and they will come and save you if you have, say, fallen down a mountain or been cast adrift at sea. You will be able to let people know where you are. This is what a Zoleo can do.
Yeah, when you were talking about getting involved in streams, I'm more thinking going up mountains. If you're ever going to go hiking or getting in the great outdoors, you want one of these. And you also want to get one of these if you're going to come overseas with us to Pakistan and Brazil next year. We don't know what the arrangements will be as far as satellite telephonic communication. What we do know is we're going to go with a fistful of Zoleos. So I suggest that if you are thinking about going, that it might be a good time to invest in one of those. And in general play anyway, as we've learnt through the course of the last year or so, talking about the Magic Box, they let you stay connected to the world when you otherwise aren't. Think about the frustrating times when you just need to send that message off. You just need to be plugged in, and you can't be because the network's down. This will make sure that's never the case in the future. Zoleo.com is where you get one from, Geoff.
It is. It's very convenient. It's very light, as you can see. I'm able to throw it up and down in one hand. I wonder if we could do something sort of infomercial style where I try to cut it in half with a carving knife or something and can't do it because it's so tough. I won't do that just in case. But yeah, it's very convenient, and it is a very powerful thing. You can be anywhere at all. Middle of the Gobi Desert, middle of the Sahara Desert, middle of the Great Sandy Desert. I love whoever came up with that name. Top work. This desert is big and sandy. Let's call it the Great Sandy Desert. You can be there and you can say, I want to send an email to my mum, and you can do it with this magic box that connects to satellites. Zoleo.com. Check them out.
It's the final word with Adam Collins and Geoff Lemon, and it being mid-April, it's that kind of year. It's the year for a yellow book, a thick yellow book called the Wisden Cricketer's Almanack. And this year, it is a book that's very different. The last 2 years, we've talked to the editor of this publication, Lawrence Booth. Once it was in the MCC library, of course, before COVID, and last year down the Zoom screen. And that's where I welcome him again today. Hello, Lawrence.
Hello, Adam. Hello, Geoff. You all right?
We are.
Doing well.
We are. Well, I guess we've all had interesting years, haven't we, in different ways? But I know 12 months ago when we talked, we already knew that this would be a fascinating edition of the book 2021. I suppose to an extent a collector's item because it's going to be thinner and different because of the lack of cricket played through the calendar year of 2020. Maybe we should start there before getting into the nitty-gritty. How do you go about assembling this book under such difficult circumstances, and how does it differ from previous years, apart from the obvious with it having fewer pages?
Yeah, it was interesting actually. When the first lockdown was announced in the UK, certainly in March, we obviously had a discussion about what will Wisden look like if there's no cricket. The worst case scenario was no cricket in the English summer, and we reckon that Wisden would still weigh in at about 800 pages. So, that's with no cricket. We thought, goodness me, how has this book sort of built up over the years? I mean, even the wartime editions the thinnest ones were sort of about 280, 290 pages, and they were 500 or 600 pages shorter than the sort of previous edition, if you like. So what we've ended up with is 1,248 pages, which is 288 pages shorter than last year, but with a bigger front two sections, the meaty reads, if you like. They're about 300 pages, which is about 60 pages up on last year. So possibly in our sort of paranoia about having a thin book, we commissioned quite a bit for the front of the book because we wanted to make sure there was still stuff to read. And the result was that we've got more to read than ever, even if it's the thinnest Wisden since, I think, 1980 or 1981.
It sounds very familiar, Lawrence, because every week that Adam and I say, there's not much to do on the show this week, we end up going for about an hour and 40 minutes. Cricket's always had that skill of making conversation even when there's not much going on. You know, that's the skill of commentary and the slow sessions of a test match. So in some ways, was that just the book reflecting the sport in its most precise possible way?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's always stuff to say about cricket, and that's why the 800-page figure came out. We knew that we could still, the part one, the big comment section, we could fill that easily with all kinds of ideas we'd had down the years that we could reuse. We thought of ways of, if there's no cricket, how would we do the 5 cricketers of the year? Would we name 5 players who should have been chosen at some point in their career? Would we name 5 players who did most for the pandemic off the field? You know, there were ways of doing it. As it turned out, there was enough cricket for us to do a regular 5. I mean, obviously there were 2 main themes last year, weren't there? There was the coronavirus, and then there was Black Lives Matter, and both of those obviously overlapped, tied in with cricket in so many different ways. So there was plenty of sort of editorial to go at, and then the cricket happened. So, you know, it came out okay in the end, I think.
And from a COVID perspective, I suppose that's front and centre when you look at the cover of the book, the very fact that it's an iPhone image taken by Danny Rubin of Stuart Broad wearing a face mask. I mean, to think that we would have even conceived of those that combination of factors to be on the front of Wisden, it seems remarkable. But yeah, that you saw that as an opportunity just to lead on the front foot and explain to those picking up the book what this is going to be about.
I think so. I think, you know, one of Wisden's charms, I guess, is that it's a social history as much as it's a cricketing history. And if you're not reflecting what's going on in the world, you're probably not doing your job. I mean, some people have objected about the cover on social media. They say they hate it. And that's a strong word. It's a cover of it. It's a photo. But if we weren't get, coronavirus was the story of the year for the rest of society as much as it was for cricket, and we had to get a mask on the front cover. That was the emblem of life last year around the world, and Stuart Broad was one of England's players of the summer, so the combination seemed to make sense to me.
And that's where you start the editor's notes as well. And perhaps that's how we'll conduct this interview as we have in previous years. Notes by the editor of Wisden is such a significant part of the discussion around release day. I mean, these words, I suppose, Lawrence, you write many, many thousands of words each year in your day job working for the Daily Mail. But you must know that when you sit down at the keyboard to compose these, that they're going to be read by everybody who matters, really, in terms of those who work in and around the game. And you kind of better get them right, or you better make sure they're something you stack up and will stand the test of time.
Yeah, that's basically it. You know, I could write any old rubbish for the Mail and frequently do and get away with it.
Certainly not saying that.
Yeah, for Wisden, you may not be in a job the following year. So, no, I don't really mean that. Daily Mail editors, I love my job there. But no, you're right. The Wisden words are sort of poured over, and they're there for time immemorial, and you do want to get them right, or at least you don't want to get them so wrong that you look daft. I mean, actually, the challenge this year was to how do I start? Because usually the first chunk of the notes is often 2 pages, and it's about England losing the Ashes, or it's about slagging off the 100. But this year was different. People had died, you know, and people involved in cricket, and I had to find a way of reflecting that without being too maudlin or sentimental, or looking at exploiting a situation. It wasn't easy, actually. It's probably the hardest start to a set of notes I've done, and this is my 10th edition.
I think that's something we all wrestle with on a, not every day, but on a regular basis covering sport, is the contradiction between the seeming irrelevance or you know, frivolousness of sport, but also the fact that it does matter somehow, even though it seems like it shouldn't matter. There are ways in which it is important, emotionally, spiritually, culturally, to so many people. And so we often get stuck between those two positions of thinking that what we're covering shouldn't be important, but it still is.
Well, and that's actually the sort of conclusion I sort of arrived at in the first bit of the note. I mean, actually, the first line of the notes this year, and I just have to read off the press releases: cricket has never been less important than in 2020, and never more. And I felt like sports meaninglessness and meaningfulness were both totally out there last year. You know, we knew it didn't matter, but at the same time, it was a wonderful distraction in many ways as the summer panned out. You know, that first Test match, England-West Indies at the GS Bowl on July the 8th, was probably watched worldwide. And it's one of the reasons, we'll go on to this later, no doubt, but why Michael Holding and Ebony Rainford-Brent's passages were made such an impact. It rained and they had plenty of time to say what they did. But yes, sport is trivial and it means everything. And that's, I think, what comes through, I hope, in the notes.
Yeah, you conclude that section by describing it as a salvation last year, which I thought was a good way to wrap it up, and kind of going through also the idea that, yeah, people died of COVID-19 who we know the Cricket Info stats pages from, but also a lot of people related to the game who we don't, and are the lifeblood of the sport, who've passed away as a consequence of the disease.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one of the most sobering moments was, and I mentioned this in the notes, David Hodgkiss, the Lancashire chairman. Now, when last year's Wisden went to press, we have him as the Lancashire chairman. We name all the officers for each county, and there he was. And by the time the book had come out, he died. So the kind of pace of what happened was frightening, and he almost embodied that. So I made sure he got an early mention in the notes.
There was the, I guess, the resourcefulness that had to be showed by plenty of people at the ECB to get some semblance of a season on, which you talk about in depth, the potential financial cliff that that English cricket was going to go off if they didn't manage to get some sort of summer staged. The fact that the counties managed to get 2 competitions in, which you described as faintly miraculous, and there was a thread running through of kind of World War I comparisons in a way, that things that have thrown cricket majorly off course, which not many things have managed to do, but you kind of, it may seem like it's trivialising, but you do in a way have to hark back to those, to the 2 world wars to find things that have disrupted cricket in that same sort of way. And you had Patrick Kidd write a long piece about how cricket was affected during the wars, and it seemed to me like that must have been on your mind, because I noticed a Rupert Brooke reference pop up in your notes as well, the sort of the last of the idealist Edwardian poets coming into World War I before the much more realistic poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon took over.
Yeah, is it, will there still be honey still for tea and all that sort of business? Yeah, I mean, we commissioned Patrick when at a point when it looked like there might be no cricket, but in the event it didn't matter really, because the point was we were talking about the last time cricket was majorly interrupted by anything, and that's what made last season sort of not quite unprecedented, because there was no cricket played in 1945 and several other summers before that. But since that year, it was the first time that something has happened beyond cricket's control, and we had to reflect that. I mean, it was interesting in the notes. I mean, ECB usually get a bit of a pasting in this section of the book, but they did a terrific job last summer. They reacted quickly. They sort of brought forward some payments to the counties. The bubble that Steve Elworth and his team created was exceptional. The only real minor threat to it was when Jofra Archer briefly went home to Hove, and that was dealt with pretty quickly. So hats off to them. They only lost just over £100 million when Tom Harrison, the chief exec, was talking about 380 was the worst case scenario. They may lose more this year. People have lost jobs. Lots of things still went wrong, but it wasn't quite as catastrophic as it could have been. And I think that's down to good management by Harrison and co.
Yeah, and it showed what a huge appetite there was for when it did return. I mean, 18 men's matches in the space of 10 weeks, those aforementioned county competitions that were squeezed in, the Bob Willis Trophy and the Blast, and thankfully West Indies women came out as well to make that possible. Otherwise, the women wouldn't have played throughout the course of the year. And I suppose when you look at the bubbles and you reflect upon them, and we've had a lot of conversations with cricketers, including Glenn Maxwell just last week, about how tough it's been for them. Perhaps this wasn't a factor that we considered beforehand, but the mental health of players that you talk about in the notes there, that it was very taxing, and we asked a lot of our cricketers last year.
Yeah, we did. And actually, I mean, that particular subject, especially for the England team at the moment, has gone front and centre really the last few months of the tour of India, and Butler going home after one test, Bairstow missing the first 2, Archer and Stokes missing Sri Lanka, and so on. There are any number of examples. And I did think, should I be doing a late twist on this? I thought, no, I'm going to stick to my guns here, because I do believe that they've got the principle right. They do have to look after their players, and let's say they played Stokes, Archer and Butler and Bairstow throughout the whole thing, we'd have been jumping all over them, wouldn't we? We're saying this is not sustainable. England are playing 17 tests in the year, 18 if you throw in Sydney or whichever the last test is going to be. In Australia. There's a World 2020, there's the IPL now, which we have to accept as part of the fixture list. These guys will go crazy if a lot of this stuff is played in bubbles. So I think you have to take your hats off to the ECB and say that they backed up their promise to look after the players' mental health.
You drew attention to the issue of inequality between cricketers. So you have these England players getting worked as hard as they are, but they're also among the best paid cricketers in the world. You have the West Indies cricketers, the Pakistan cricketers, the Bangladesh cricketers, and so on, who are being paid an absolute fraction of that amount. The West Indies players took a 50% pay cut as well, just to try to keep things on the road this year, and yet those teams are the ones who were integral to having the richer cricket countries be able to keep their own economies on course. That disparity is something that we don't really talk about a lot, and particularly, when looking at issues like corruption in cricket and so on, the vulnerability when some cricketers are paid so much less.
Yeah, that's a good point. That specific point you make at the end, I didn't get into, but that's probably one for future notes. But it's a good point. I mean, Jason Holder spoke very eloquently about the unlevel playing field at the end of the England tour, and he was quite right. And what played out was totally predictable, wasn't it? That different countries cancelled exactly the tours you'd expect them to cancel. Australia, I think I said, moved heaven and earth to make sure India could come. I mean, look, from a financial perspective, you can hardly blame them, but that is the game as it is now, and the second tier test nations, if you like, or let's say the teams outside the so-called big three, were left to rot in a way. I mean, West Indies are supposed to be grateful for the fact that England have agreed to one more test and two more T20s for the start of 2022. Should they be that grateful for that? I don't know, really. England are going to Pakistan for two T20s later this year. These feel like sort of scraps that are tossed really by the big teams to say that they're doing something to help the smaller teams. But look, it's a huge issue, and it's going to keep playing out for the next few years.
Yeah, as you put at the end there, cricket seems happy to ram home the point about financial inequality with respect to the way that different boards treat countries that perhaps don't quite have the same financial clout. The heroes of last summer really were, in many respects, those West Indian tourists, and the timing was kind of astonishing, wasn't it, with Black Lives Matter, so much attention through the month of June for obvious reasons after the murder of George Floyd, and then we reach the first Test match at the Ageas Bowl. The knee being taken, the fists being raised by the West Indies team as well, the forceful comments being made by every West Indian player in that diary room that Sky set up. This wasn't just like a one-off statement and that was it. They were all happy to articulate their position about racism in the community and in the sport. And of course, that's the morning where Ebony Rainford-Brent and Mikey Holding make their sort of memorable intervention on television. But perhaps what I found more interesting about the notes section is that you're very sharp here about cricket being happy to, quote, give a sympathetic ear or a pat on the shoulder or a promise that things must change. But we look later in the season, no knee was being taken when England played Pakistan, nor when Australia came later in the year. The women did, but this is the men I'm focusing on here. And as you say, by not taking a knee, cricket raised a finger.
Yeah, I was astonished by what happened, as you can tell from what I'd written in the notes. It seemed like such a simple gesture, such a basic show of solidarity, and it felt like an insult to the West Indies. Were we saying that England were only taking a knee to appease a black team? It certainly looked like that, because they carry on doing it against Ireland, and then they seem to get bored and they hide behind this line that education is more important than protest. I mean, Aaron Finch said the same thing when he came over for the white ball series, and England and Australia clearly sort of agreed this line behind the scenes, and it just looks so bad. These mainly white teams with terrible histories of race relations in both countries. The black team's gone home and they decide not to do it, and then people hide behind Black Lives Matter is a Marxist movement, they want to defund the police. They find all kinds of reasons for not doing the basic gesture. And of course, that plays right into the hands of the people we don't want it to play into the hands of. And I thought it was appalling.
Yeah, and the old don't mix politics and sports set kind of almost, I felt that position almost prevailed, which seems like such a contrast to, I think it was the 8th of July, wasn't it, the day where England started their series against the West Indies and the Mikey Ebony moment played out. To think that, within 2 months it was back to, you can't mix sport and politics. And as you point out in the notes, the incongruity of that when you think that it's 50 years on from the Stop the 70 tour, which the Almanack had such a big role in revisiting last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the laziest argument in sport, isn't it? You hear it again and again by all the wrong people.
Yeah.
Well, you can't disentangle sport and politics. They're intrinsically related. Most of the cricket that England just played in India was played at a stadium named after India's current Prime Minister. Don't mix sport and politics. There you go. You also pointed towards the Azim Rafiq case at Yorkshire with the same sort of expediency shown by those in charge, where this was reported a couple of times. He gave an interview, a written interview, he gave a podcast interview, and it was only when a major cricket publication picked up on this, that the third time the story had been circled over publicly, let alone what he may have said privately, that Yorkshire decided they ought to actually address it, and that it became something that was responded to publicly. Whether or not that was in a lasting way, I suppose remains to be seen, but you're not necessarily optimistic about that.
Well, I'm more optimistic than I was 6 months ago, I think. I think probably most people who look at how cricket is dealing with things generally, there's an upward curve, even if there are blips along the way. Yeah, I mean, I thought Yorkshire handled it poorly. As you say, they only really reacted when there was pressure put on them by Cricinfo, who've got a global reach. And one of the other things I mentioned in that section was the use of Steve for Cheteshwar Pujara, the nickname that he was given at Yorkshire, and how that gets laughed at in certain pieces of commentary, and how that, I reckon 5 years ago, would barely have been sort of noticed in terms of the current debate, but now we're all far more attuned to what that actually means and how hurtful that might be. But the fact that people can still chuckle about it on commentary shows how far we still have to go.
Shifting gears to the on-field action, James Anderson and Stuart Broad both reached significant milestones in the summer of 2020 at Manchester and Southampton, respectively. I like that you, again, go back to the Big Brother diary room. That Broad spray, I mean, it's funny now, it's nearly a year on, but it was a massive story when he went in there and they got him to essentially get stuck into the selectors for not picking him for that first test. And Jimmy, I suppose, a more subtle version of that after he had that bad first test against Pakistan to reinforce that he wanted to play the next week and not be rested. But I suppose where you get to in your piece is that why are we talking about pensioning off two blokes who are still quite outstanding, especially at home?
Yeah, they both sort of pulled rank, didn't they, with the media? It was very much.
And we all went with it, didn't we? I mean, let's be honest. Like, to a person, I mean, it was great. It was fantastic. We were up for it.
It was glorious drama, and it worked a treat. And heck, I mean, Broad then gets 29 wickets in 5 tests at 13 apiece, and bowls as well as ever. And Anderson, when he gets a chance, still looks great. I mean, I wasn't in. I was slightly tongue-in-cheek. I said, well, let's just pick them both until they sort of drop dead. I mean, but there is an interesting philosophical debate there about how you select players, because do you pick for the future or do you pick for the present? England are so damn obsessed with the Gabba in November or December, whenever it's going to be. Can we play them both? But look, they're still pretty good, both of them. And Anderson is actually as good as he ever has been. I mean, his performances in Gaul and Chennai were sensational. This is a 38-year-old in 40-degree heat who's going for 1.5 and over. It's taking 5 and 6 wickets. So why it just feels like England sometimes overthink things. You'll be surprised to hear that. That's my basic view of English cricket down the years.
And then Joe Root as well, someone who gets a fair bit of overthinking in his direction. I suppose the way we've thought of him the last few years is always as England Test captain and someone who's overburdened and doesn't look like he's having a terribly good time. But Joe Root, the batsman, got to have a moment in the sun, a couple of double hundreds plus his 186 in between times, that ridiculous sequence from Sri Lanka to the first test in India.
Yeah, and the weird thing about that sequence was it was almost like he'd gone away and decided to score some big runs. So, was it that straightforward? Had you not thought before about your conversion rate from 50s to 100s? Had you not watched Kane Williamson not give it away time and time again? Because that's how he sort of presented it. It's like it's a sort of a flick switch, and he said, I can do this. I mean, it helped, I think, that the Sri Lankan attack wasn't great. I mean, Aberdeen was a good bowler. The rest weren't up to much, but he swept beautifully, didn't he? And no one else in that England team was scoring big runs on that Sri Lanka tour. So he almost sort of knocked on the door again of the Fab Four. He fell away a bit in India after that, but so did most players on both teams, really. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes this summer and in the Ashes. It's a big year for him.
Yeah, now having passed his 30th birthday as well, tends to be when players of his ilk tend to be their most productive. You've given me a job this year, Lawrence. You mentioned at one point when reflecting on India's extraordinary series in Australia and their rise, and you used the reference point that the last time Australia lost at the Gabba that Bob Hawke was still Prime Minister. Well, I want to find out the first time that RJL Hawke was mentioned in Wisden, because of course he played for the ACT back in the 50s. So I wonder whether he might have got a mention in one of the mid-50s almanacs. But that's a digression. The main point you were making there is that the adversity that India were up against, whether it's sledging, crowd abuse, injuries, an attack with 1,000 fewer wickets, the all-out 36, the quarantine, the lack of Virat Kohli for the last 3 test matches, and in turn you say it's right there alongside the Calypso summer of 60-61, Australia-India in 2001, the Ashes of 2005, and I like the end bit too, the end of certainty, Francis Fukuyama, which I suppose is the sort of thing you get taught about at university, but reflecting that this is the kind of almost the natural end point where India now have the opportunity to be the defining side of the next generation in all 3 formats.
Yeah, and perhaps of all the things you mentioned, perhaps the most astonishing phenomenon was these young guys just coming straight in and flourishing straight away in one of the most sort of hostile test environments you can get for an Indian cricketer. That to me was the worrying sign for the rest of the world. You've got these Indian B and C team players looking like geniuses, and Rishabh Pant batting like in a T20 game and that run chase at the gap. I mean, it was sensational stuff. And really, India, they've got no excuse now not to dominate world cricket for time immemorial.
Yeah, but there are still those things ahead of them that they haven't done yet. They haven't dominated in England, really. They've never won a series in South Africa. There's the talk of their rise has to be backed up by the performances at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. There are still things to be done, but you wouldn't back against them winning in England this summer. I mean, I know they lost 4-1 last time, but it was a kind of weird 4-1. It could have been 3-2 to India. I think England will win, but I wouldn't be surprised if India won.
The Wisden Trophy, one close to your heart. This was, a triumph of boring populism in an era when boring populism is triumphing. Okay, well, nobody knows what that trophy name is about, so let's name it after the 2 most famous players from the 2 countries, Viv Richards and Ian Botham. People remember them when really the connection between them and there wasn't much of a history between them as far as great cricket matches or great test series went. The proposal that you had for Leary Constantine to be the person that it should have been named after seemed to make sense, I think, to me and Adam, but generally in an age of populism, that's too far away. We don't remember him. He was from the 1930s, whatever. We need somebody we need the Andrew Flintoff, Kevin Peterson trophy. Yeah,
that's basically what happened, isn't it? And also Viv and both of them are still alive, so they can be interviewed before each series and give it a bit of we all know they're great cricketers in their own way, but as you say, I mean, England West Indies was always a walkover in the days of both, and he averaged 21 with the bat and 35 with the ball against them. He never did much. There's already a Sir Vivian Richards Trophy played for by, was it South Africa and
West Indies,
yeah. So that's been going. Did they know that? I doubt it. I just thought it was a knee-jerk response to Mike Atherton done a column in the Times, where Andy Bull had done something in the Guardian, and Atherton picked it up in the Times and came out with the Richards Botham idea himself. Within days, the ECB had moved on this, so they denied that it was anything to do with Atherton, but come on, guys. And in fact, there was a suggestion briefly that they were going to name last year's trophy to make that the first Richards Botham trophy. But the weird thing was that the players were name-checking the Wisden Trophy more than I'd ever heard them. It felt like something that both teams really wanted to win, even not knowing that it was going to be the last Wisden Trophy. And as you say, Leary Constantine just seemed to make much more sense. He'd kind of suffered racial abuse in England. He had a foot in both camps. He understood the complexities of the Anglo-Caribbean dynamic, if you like. He became the first black peer in the UK. He'd settled in Nelson in Lancashire, played league. There are all kinds of reasons why he worked so much better. And of course, he was the driving force behind the Wisden Trophy originally in 1963. So there were lots of nice reasons why it should have been him. But yeah, you're right. Not many kids would have heard of him today. So let's call it the Richards Botham Trophy.
I like the bit about men showing leadership on the family front. You start with Mitchell Starc, of course, leaving South Africa to be there with his wife, Alyssa Healy, for the T20 World Cup final at the MCG on International Women's Day last year. Then that rolls into Joe Root and Kane Williamson, both missing high-profile test matches to be at the birth of children. And then Virat Kohli, missing 3 test matches in, I suppose, the biggest away series that India play against Australia. And you note what a diversion that is compared to how it used to be, where family often would have to come second in favour of cricket.
Yeah, I mean, Kohli was the most amazing one, really, wasn't it? Three tests of a huge series. I mean, you know, I doffed my cap to him. Actually worked out quite well for India because Rahane was a good man for that situation. It was weird, actually, because, you know, we talk about changing attitudes. I was interviewing Steve Waugh about something around that time, and I asked him about Kohli, and he clearly couldn't quite believe what Kohli was doing. There's still a bit of old school, even in the cricketers who've retired only sort of, you know, in the last 20 years. So I think that it'll change. But yeah, you know, it did show a certain degree of modern thinking, and it's going to happen more, isn't it, as they play cricket every week of the year.
You had a poignant little farewell to Ian Bell, the last of the 2005 English cricketers to have still been playing first class. There is still a link with Jimmy Anderson from the free-to-air cricket era, although he wasn't in that 05 series, but he did play cricket on free-to-air telly in England and then was back again in POG form in 2021 when Channel 4 picked up the India-England series. Yeah,
it was quite a nostalgic moment for sort of English cricket fans of my age, I guess, or who can remember the terrestrial era, which is sort of often described now in sort of dinosaur terms by people who think that the debate is over, and I refuse to accept that the debate is over. I think that Channel 4 got decent figures given that they were given it at the last minute, and it started at 4 a.m. UK time, and England were getting trounced for much of that series. You know, there's this sort of straw man argument where people say, well, English cricket will be nowhere without Sky's money, and of course you accept the money argument, but no one in their right mind is saying let's move everything back to terrestrial. No one is saying that, so let's not argue on those terms. The point is that there needs to be a bit more balance. I suggest in the notes that perhaps Channel 4 could get one test a summer. In the days when Sky used to do one test a summer, when the terrestrial TV had it, no one thought that was unreasonable, so why shouldn't it be unreasonable the other way around?
Yeah, that's an idea that Ali Martin's advanced in The Guardian a number of times as well, isn't it? The idea that there could be some sort of simulcast arrangement in the same way that their high-profile other sporting events get their day in the sun once a year. Time will tell. Somewhat related, a note for the ECB Reporters Network that I was surprised to read this, but also glad to read it as well, that I suppose at time of printing, the Reporters Network was going to be completely gutted, and it was going to be 6 instead of 18 reporters making their way, covering the counties, and almost emblematic of the times, really, that the counties themselves were going to have to step up and cover their own games instead of having independent journalists there. And of course, that's a bit of a slippery slope. I suppose that the good news, Lawrence, is that there was a last-minute compromise found the week before the championship season started last week, so all the games are being covered. But as you say, it's noteworthy that they were in the gun to begin with.
Yeah, it's extremely worrying. I don't think the ECB really realised that the implications. I know we like to think we're all very important, don't we, as journalists, and we sometimes we let that get out of hand. But in this instance, I think if there'd only been sort of 6 reporters for 18 counties, essentially, then everyone would suffer. And no one's being held to account. I mean, that's the other side of sports journalism. It's not just reporting the runs and wickets, it's talking to administrators and trying to encourage them to run the game as well as possible. And that certainly couldn't have happened in the same way. You know, that's already happening to a degree all over the world. There are in-house, you know, reporters and administrators aren't pushed as much as they should be. The ECB backed down, and I'm glad, but this, even though the note feels perhaps slightly out of date now, maybe it's a marker for future when they try something again like this, because they will.
There's wherever there is money to be saved, there'll be somebody trying to cut those costs. The issue of status, we've spent a fair bit of time on this show complaining about the fact that that Packers World Series cricket tests are not given first-class status, considering some of the incredibly trash games that are recognised as first-class matches throughout cricket history. Your campaign that you're leading is for the 1970s rest of the world tests, which were promoted as tests at the time, but were formally unrecognised, and that meant that Alan Jones, the England batsman, the Welsh batsman, who who played in those matches and thought he was a Test player, was later told that he wasn't. He was recently given England cap number 696, which was a nice moment for England, saying that as far as the ECB was concerned, he was a Test player, even if the ICC didn't recognise those matches.
Yeah, and for me, it was the sentimentality of it, which was a nice thing. It showed that, I mean, we'd been talking about money and the cynicism of administrators and so on, but actually it was a rare moment where they said they looked at the human side of it. I mean, I think we have to accept that those games will never be acknowledged as Test matches. I mean, in fairness to the ICC, the old TCCB, as the ECB was then, marketed those games as Tests, but they didn't get any permission from the ICC to do it. They persuaded the guys like Seabus to come over. He said, "I'm only coming if they're Test matches." They said, "Yeah, they are Tests. Come on." They're Tests. And so it was played as Tests, it was sold as Tests. But when the ICC next had an AGM in 1972, they said, "We never said they were Test matches." So in a sense, they were never sanctioned. But regardless of that, they felt like Test matches, and it was just nice for Alan Jones. I was on the Zoom call where he got his cap, and it was a surprise, and he looked absolutely thrilled.
And I suppose you can take some real credit for the Almanack there, if not for the fact that you pushed so hard last year to have a conversation around what happened in 1970. It's entirely possible that that presentation never would have taken place.
Who knows? Actually, weirdly, I'd interviewed Alan in the Daily Mail to mark 50 years of it, and the ECB said it was that interview that sort of sparked them to do it. So maybe for once, something I wrote in the Mail had some impact.
And you finish off the notes section by going back to COVID, but I suppose in a nice way, the strange joys of watching players operate in these unusual times, having to climb into the stands and collect balls after boundaries have been struck, as you say, reassuringly unglamorous like the rest of us. It felt like a nice place to put a full stop on it.
It was, yeah, it felt like the democratisation of cricket. They knew how we feel on most sort of Saturdays and Sundays, clambering around in the bushes.
Lawrence, that's the end of the editor's notes section. So through the rest of part one, as you say, it's all the opinion pieces, and we might just skip through a few of these and encourage people to read them accordingly. The first essay is Scraps of Comfort by Duncan Hamilton, who, of course, is one of the most illustrious authors in the game, having won the book prize a number of times. He writes an incredibly long first-person essay about, which I haven't been able to read in full yet because it's quite lengthy, but I suppose his scrapbook of COVID cricket and how he went about it. What was the thinking behind getting Duncan to write a piece like this and devoting so much real estate to it at the very front of the book?
I suppose that was probably the biggest challenge, actually, was what is our COVID piece going to be at the front of the book? I mean, I can talk about it in the notes, but what will the part one piece on it be? And I felt in the end that it had to be something about the emotional impact of cricket disappearing. And we had a timeline alongside it where we said what had happened with COVID. So we kind of covered the nuts and bolts of COVID's effect on cricket in that timeline. But then I wanted a kind of elegiac response to it. And Duncan does that very well. I mean, he's written 2 books on, with a cricket, what's happening with the county game, and the world's gone to pot. And I didn't want to sort of, we've all gone to the dogs piece, but I wanted a reflective piece on what the absence of cricket meant, and I think he pulled it off.
There was a move towards positivity with the piece on how cricket helped, looking at things that players had done that were actually useful during the pandemic. So, people supporting the NHS, Ravi Bopara's free chicken shop food, but a range of good news stories, I suppose, when it could have been very much the bad news almanac, where because it was such a grim year, I suppose you had to make a conscious choice to look for some areas of positivity.
Yeah, and also it showed that these cricketers they're nice men and women on the whole, aren't they? They had a lot of them have a social conscience in a way that perhaps one or two other sports don't. I mean, the contrast was often made with football last year when the Premier League footballers were very reluctant to take a pay cut. I know Marcus Rashford became the star of the year, and his social conscience, the Manchester United player. But cricket came out of it quite well, I thought, and I did want to celebrate that. People running marathons in their back garden, and yes, the chicken shop, and all kinds of gestures made. Sam Billings offering to help old ladies do their shopping in Canterbury. I mean, there are any number of. I could have that section could have been 3 pages, not 1. But it was nice to reflect it.
Yeah, it was quite a powerful statement, I thought, actually. All these cricketers who are going through an awful lot, which includes Jack Leach. A lot's been said about Jack Leach and his trials and tribulations inside the bubble, not playing for 60 days, being the understudy, of course, having been shielding earlier in the year due to Crohn's disease. But you got him to write about it himself.
Yeah, well, I thought because of the Crohn's disease, he was say a natural, but his perspective I thought would have been interesting because there would have been that extra element of concern probably. I mean, he did say he got a text message from the government early on in the piece saying that he was at risk, and the heart rate went up a bit, but once he got used to the idea that he was going to be quite well looked after in that bubble, he probably it was as safe as anyone as a result, because he was in the unburstable ECB bubble, so there was no way he was catching anything. But then there was the mental strain of not playing a single match apart from a Joss Butler 11 v and Owen Morgan 11, whatever it was that played in a 20 over smash. I can't remember what it was, but he had to deal with the strains of not getting out there at all and really being stuck in that bubble. And he dealt with it with good grace, as you expect. He's a lovely guy, and I think he came out of it mentally tougher in the end.
The end of the Kolpak era was a particularly significant one, something that happened in 2020 that wasn't COVID related, with the political repercussions of Brexit, meaning that Kolpak players couldn't play as home players for county teams anymore. And you had Dan Gallen writing the South African view of things, Alan Gardner writing the English view of things. This felt like a really significant sort of end of an era in that respect.
Yeah, exactly right. When there was a game, I think Alan mentions it in his piece, 2008, Northamptonshire v Leicestershire at Grace Road, and I think there were 13 non-England qualified players out of the 22, and sort of 9 of them were South Africans. And he talked to Paul Nixon, who was playing at the time. He said, "Yeah, we probably did over-egg the pudding," which was a nice way of putting it. And that's something. I mean, Northants were known for a while as the steel box, not the steel bat, which is their usual nickname. Painful for me as a fan, but it was going that way. And so yeah, both Alan and Dan reflect on what Kolpak meant to the two different countries, and Dan comes down on the sort of they'll always be branded with a scarlet K, that lots of people will regard these guys as mercenaries who decided that for whatever reason they couldn't make it in South Africa, and it's obviously more complex over there, and decided to cash in England. And now, of course, there's a bit of a trickle back in the other direction. And that's good, isn't it? That's good for South African cricket.
Yeah, and the way that Dan was able to articulate that, I mean, whilst we think about it as being an economic decision, a lot of the guys that came out here, it was all tied into racial politics and quotas and all the rest of it. So it's important terrain to deal with at the end of that era. Geoff already mentioned the Patrick Kidd piece about cricket stopping play, but there's also one related to it by Stephen Lynch, or immediately following it, about the Spanish flu Wisdens. I went through this. I think I might have called you last year and said something similar that I wanted to write about this, because I was trying to find in Wisden around 1919, 1920 references to Spanish flu when preparing a piece. And there's kind of nothing there. A couple of mentions of influenza, but it's remarkable to think a century on that the entire book's devoted to it. But the last pandemic of this size and scale, I suppose, which did have a massive effect on cricket, just didn't really feature in the almanac back then.
Yeah, it was bizarre, actually. It's one of the things we discussed this year in the obituaries is, are we going to mention, if someone dies of COVID, are we going to mention that? Because usually our rule of thumb is, if they're, let's say, of an age where you wouldn't be surprised if they died, we don't give the reason for them dying. But if they're 50 or below, we do say that they were knocked over by a bus or died of cancer or whatever. But for COVID, I thought we've got to do this, because the Wisden of the time you mentioned, 1919, 1920, were pretty poor about saying who died of the Spanish flu. There were occasional references to influenza. We think about 20 of those years. It was because 1918 to 20 was the global pandemic. But it was almost like the relief at the end of the First World War had overshadowed everything else. And they didn't really want to get into the more bad news about the Spanish flu pandemic. 228,000, they reckon, died in the UK. So that's a lot more than have currently died of COVID. But it was kind of not touched upon greatly, and many more millions died around the world. It could be 100 million, they think, died around the world, and what are we at the moment? 3 or 4 million globally with COVID. So completely different kettle of fish, but perhaps. And I wanted to make sure that this Wisden placated future historians. I didn't want them looking through this Wisden and going, why can't we see what effect COVID had on cricketers? So that was part of my thinking.
In the midst of all of that, you, as you mentioned earlier, you had to find the way to name the Wisden Five Cricketers of the Year, the thing that you have to explain to everybody every year, that it's about players who had performances during the English season only, and it can't include anyone who's been named before. So that's hopefully prevents all the people who get mad at the decisions that were made. The two local players who had significant summers, particularly in the Test team, being Zach Crawley and Dom Sibley. Sibley was written about by Rob Smythe, Zach Crawley by Tim Delisle. Two of the visiting players, Jason Holder, who was written up by George Dobell, and Mohammad Rizwan by Osman Samiuddin. And then the fifth one, the one that I'm sure most people will be so delighted to see get in there, Darren Stevens gets a gong in his mid-40s, written up by Mark Pennell as one of the Wisden Five.
Yeah, finally. I reckon since I've been doing this job, I've had more emails about why haven't you named Darren Stevens than any other cricketer in the world. It is astonishing. And I'm not saying I've caved into pressure, but I thought he deserved it last year. He took 29 wickets at 15 for Kent at the age of 44, for God's sake, 3 5-wicket hauls. And he just cemented his weird status as this sort of wicket-taking machine. For a guy who, when he was at Leicestershire, his first county, barely took a wicket. It's astonishing. He averaged 60 or something with the ball. He goes to Kent and he becomes this sort of destroyer of worlds. So I was really happy to give it to him. And actually, he started this season with 100 against Northants in the Championship, which I saw someone write that he'd now scored first-class hundreds in 4 different decades. It's astonishing.
I love that. I mean, in a way, I suppose Crawley and Sibley and Jason Holder picked themselves. Mohammad Rizwan was a pretty crafty pick in many respects, because since the English summers concluded, he's gone on to achieve great things for Pakistan. And yeah, Darren Stevens, I was wondering your thought process on that. To an extent, was it kind of like a lifetime achievement award, like when you were going through it? Because you could have easily given it to, say, Craig Overton, who dominated last year during the Bob Willis Trophy, and I think he was the PCA Player of the Year in that competition. But you went down the path of Stevens. Was it, to an extent, acknowledging the extraordinary body of work he's built up at Kent?
Yeah, to a degree. I think it's one of those ones where, all things being equal, you go with the guy who probably won't get another chance. At least Stevens may be going at the age of 63 and we'll go, we should have chosen him when he was 58 and he had that great summer. But you give it to that guy, and yes, and a body of work. But also I thought, standing alone, a 44, you have to take into account his age, is a 44-year-old taking 29 wickets at 15. It's not a young England hopeful taking 30 wickets at 18 or whatever Overton took. It's a 44-year-old. And I think it's not just his body of work, but it's the physical remarkability of what he did.
I like it. So that's the Wisden Five, and a series of essays that follow in relation to Black Lives Matter. I like that you kind of got Ebony to really spell it out over a few thousand words, including the extraordinary ACE program that we've had Ebony on the show a couple of times to discuss, visionary initiative, and kind of taking it to the ECB in keeping with the spirit of your editor's notes about the fact that they can't sort of take their foot off the pedal here. This isn't sort of a one-year commitment, and she's going to hold them to account, and I like that.
Yeah, and I mean, it was interesting, that piece, because she did not want to just slam administrators. She'd also done her personal catharsis. She didn't want to cry again about the treatment she'd undergone. She wanted to move forward from a psychological perspective for her own mental health, and I got that. So let's make this how we move forward piece. At the same time, that's going to involve criticism of the boards. But I think all her criticism is fair. She makes some good points. She was angry about taking a knee. She feels angry about BAME as an acronym. She says it's not a helpful acronym at all for people who aren't white, essentially. They're all being lumped together in one group. And she regards that as a sort of a small symptom of the problem. She's from Lambeth in South London, where there's a big African Caribbean community. She reckons that there are about 33,000 10 to 19-year-old black kids and that they're not being used. Surrey hasn't reflected that demographic at all, and that is a scandal. And in fairness to Surrey, they are, they're pretty forward thinking. When she took this to them, they took it on board, and they will move in the right direction. But her energy is sensational. she is a force of nature and a great thing for English cricket.
Yeah, she really is, and I like the way that's. There's an insert of all the players who spoke openly about racism in cricket last year. You use their words. I mean, there's no sort of no needing to colour it in when the quotes are so strong from, we already talked about Azim Rafiq, but Keith Barker, Adil Rashid, Jofra Archer, Michael Carberry, Moeen Ali, Devon Malcolm, the list goes on really. And then following that by, in terms of using their own words, Michael Holding, it was an edited extract of what he said to Sky. I mean, it doesn't get really any more eloquent than what he said that day. So your decision was, instead of getting him to write about it again, pull together and assemble the words he said that day.
Yeah, I mean, because that morning we already spoken about was so powerful, it just seemed to make sense to record those words forevermore. In Wisden, we didn't need to do anything more than that. I suppose it looks like a lazy piece of editing, doesn't it? But actually, no, you've got it there in Wisden now. If people talk about that Holding monologue, well, there it is in black and white, as it were. And you don't need to go searching for it online. It's there on the page, and it speaks for itself.
The leading cricketers of the year, as distinct from the 5 cricketers of the year, Beth Mooney and Ben Stokes got the gongs. Ralph Nicholson and Dean Wilson wrote those two up.
Yeah, Beth. With the Women's Award, you think, is it which of Perry or Lanning is it going to be? And then you look, and then you actually, Beth Mooney was the star. She was the star of the T20 World Cup. That innings in the final was brilliant, and in front of 86,000 at the MCG. And then she's the star, even though her team didn't win, of the Women's Big Bash. And frightening for the rest of the women's game, really, that she can overtake Lanning and Perry in that sort of pecking order. They've got so many world-class players, haven't they? Go on, Adam.
Oh, no, I was going to say we were absolutely chuffed as well reading through that, because, I mean, she's been one of our... I think we were, Geoff, banging on about Beth Mooney 5 or 6 years ago when she was well before national selection, to think that she would make the Australian team, not as a wicketkeeper, but as a batter alone, and now reach these heights and now get recognised in Wisden as the leading player in the world. It's a mighty achievement, given where she was at the start of that journey compared to where she is now. It's pretty cool. As you say, I mean, you look through it, there's Perry last year, Mandana before that, Madali Raj before that, a couple of Lannings, another Perry, and here's Beth Mooney, the plucky Queenslander.
Yeah, and it's great that we're getting more names. Sometimes you worry that the women's game is a bit top heavy, but we need it to sort of spread out. You mentioned Stokes, and Stokes was a sort of an interesting one, because in a way there was sort of, there was men's cricket, but there was less men's cricket in the sense there was no global tournament to get stuck into to choose the guy. But Stokes still did pretty well, didn't he? Averaged 58 with the bat and 18 with the ball, and he was, he played those 2 innings against West Indies at Manchester where he grinds out 170, and then he smashes 70 opening off 50 balls to set up that win, and then he takes wickets and he runs to the boundary to stop. Actually, did they get 4 runs in the end? I can't remember. But anyway, he was everywhere, and then he's got the personal backdrop. His dad's ailing and finally dies in December, and he has to leave the Pakistan series early. So it was a poignant performance as well. And of course, we forget this reflects the calendar year, and he began the year with one of his tour de forces in Cape Town. Game looked like it was heading for a draw, and he grabs the ball and says, "I'll do it." So he was a force of nature, and I couldn't see who had really done enough apart from him to oust him from that position. Kohli hadn't had a great year. There was no one else in the men's game across the calendar year, across the formats, who I felt had done enough to knock Stokes off the perch, but people may disagree. It's
like a world championship wrestling belt. Once you're wearing it, you've got to be defeated, and I suppose he's back-to-back champion now, and Virat Kohli won it 3 years before him, which means that it looks odd that Steve Smith's never there, but that's on account of the fact that he's never been able to knock off Kohli in that era when they were 1 and 2, and now it's Ben Stokes. I think my favourite news section of the book this year, Lawrence, was the Hugh Chevellier, your co-editor, has these 3 photos of the 1950s. Now, I'm familiar with all 3 photos, but seeing them presented this way, and knowing it's going to be a section going forward and a way to acknowledge the beautiful photos that were taken and powerful photos that were taken in our game before Wisden started recognising a photo of the year in 2011 or whatever it was. So this is a clever new initiative.
Yeah, and actually this is one of those ideas that was discussed when we were worried there was going to be no cricket. But then we liked it and we thought we'd stick with it anyway. And we get Patrick Eager, the sort of doyen of cricket photography, to give Hugh his reasons for why he chose the three picks. And they're all social histories, aren't they? It's sort of it's the three W's relaxing on the outfield, and surprisingly few pictures of all three of them exist actually. And this was a lovely one, just their humanity sort of speaking to the lens. There are young boys climbing up lampposts to get a glimpse of the Ashes test at the Oval in '53, and then there's Compton and Edrich walking off the Oval after England have sneaked a 1-0 win and being thronged in the outfield. And you just study the crowd. There are bowler hats, there are sort of old policemen, there are kids in school uniform. It's just, there's so much going on in the picture that tells you so much about England of that time.
The competitions are, they're a way to reach out to the broader cricket community, get people involved who may not have been involved before necessarily. The Wisden writing competition, Philip Hardman won that. And then the photo of 2020, a young up-and-comer by the name of Stephen Waugh managed to take that gong this year. So nice of you to reach out beyond the establishment.
Yeah, apparently he likes taking a photo. I've not heard it. But there's a picture of some desert cricket in Rajasthan. I mean, he's lucky enough to go on a little tour of India and take some snaps. And I interviewed him about it for Wisden Cricket Monthly. And I always love speaking to cricketers about stuff outside cricket, because you find out what kind of guys they are, really, in a way that sometimes cricket doesn't always reveal, or they're forced to wear masks and so on. And the little boy in it came out, and it was quite heartwarming.
The only essay that you devote any space in the front half of the book in terms of retirement is MS Dhoni, which almost speaks for itself given the footprint that he leaves on the game. There's also an essay from you, Lawrence, where you get a chance to flex some muscle on 50 years of the one-day international, often the maligned format, really, but you go back and look at the first one in January 1971 and then go back decade by decade using sort of one player to reflect how the game was played almost in their image.
Yeah, we did think, should we choose the 5 greatest ODI cricketers of all time? I thought that's impossible, because you're comparing different eras. When, are you honestly telling me that Viv Richards doesn't get in because his strike rate was 89? I'm sorry, but you had to so we thought it was probably fairer to do it by decade. And actually you end up with a sort of bit of a history of one-day cricket then as well, because you go with Viv Richards in the 70s, or West Indies win the first 2 World Cups. Kapil Dev in the 80s, India famously went 83, and he catches Viv at Lord's over his shoulder famously, so there's a nice handing of the baton there. Tendulkar in the 90s, who else? Murali, a spin bowler in the 2000s when T20's coming into play, and you'd think who'd want to be a spinner, but actually Murali holds it together and still goes at sort of 3 or 4 and over. And then Virat Kohli, the greatest chaser in the history of white ball cricket in the last decade. So yeah, we end up with 3 Indians, a West Indian and a Sri Lankan. The only complaint you might have, and you two might well have, is that there is no Australian, and they've won 5 World Cups. And I hear you in advance. But each decade I was looking at it going, I mean, Gilchrist came very close to, it was Gilchrist v Murali was incredibly close. But I thought what Gilchrist did brilliantly was he was an amazing pinch hitter, but that had sort of been done before by others. So he wasn't inventing a new genre there. As I felt Murali was perhaps flying the flag for an entire species by himself. But again, it's a debate.
I think they'll survive. I think they'll be okay with their 5 World Cups, Lawrence. Something that happened last year, which I don't think got enough attention, so I'm glad that Derek Pringle was invited to write an essay about the end of first-class university cricket. All academic now, it's titled. When Cambridge defeated Oxford at Fenners last year, kind of that was that. And I suppose with everything else that was going on, the relegation of the MCCUs to no longer be considered first class wasn't sort of front and centre. But yeah, Derek Pringle, in terms of modern players, he'd be the one that's most well known for what he did for his university, making the test team while he was still at Cambridge and playing so many games there. I suppose it is the end of an era, because when you look back at the 20th century, especially what the universities did, especially Oxford and Cambridge, of course, were a significant part of the English summer.
Yeah, and it's one of those pieces where you think, are we going to look a bit elitist here, sort of bigging up Oxford and Cambridge? And yeah, it probably does, but we are simply reflecting quite a big strand of English cricket history. I just made a note here. Oxford produced 13 England captains and 8 captains for other Test teams. Cambridge produced 21 England captains and 7 captains for other Test teams. That's a massive contribution. Yeah. I'm not saying they learned all their cricket in Oxford and Cambridge, but they went through the system there, and they got a chance to play first-class cricket and to get noticed. And I mean, Pringle himself averaged something like 50 with the bat and 25 with the ball in first-class cricket for Cambridge on very flat pitches, which might explain the batting, but not necessarily the bowling. And there are some great stories there. I mean, Everton Weeks, who died last year, there was a game in his obit at Fenners, West Indies v Cambridge at Fenners in 1950, I guess. Cambridge bat first and score 594 for 4 against West Indies. Cambridge University, a bunch of students. And then West Indies come out and get 730 for 3. And Weeks is 300 not out by the end and could have kept going. I mean, imagine where that innings might have gone if they'd kept going. It'd have been sort of 1,500 all out or something. So there are some good stories going back there. And the degree to which Oxford and Cambridge kind of feathered English cricket's nest and the reliance on this kind of officer class as captain is an interesting historical take on English cricket in its own right. And Pringle does it nicely.
You also had a look at the history of another publication, 100 Years of the Cricketer magazine, which James Coyne wrote. And you got quite a coup because you got Garfield Sobers to write a piece. You just mentioned the recent death of Everton Weeks, the last of the 3 Ws, the 3 great Bajan cricketers to die. And Sir Garfield Sobers gave his view on them and what they had achieved.
Yeah, and it's a lovely start to the piece where he remembers as a young boy listening. West Indies were in England for their famous 1950 tour. Ramadan and Valentine, those 2 little pals of mine, and so on. They win at Lord's, and he's going to school in the mornings, and he can hear his neighbours listening on the radio, and he's peeking in through the windows so he can hear what's going on. And then, of course, he makes his Test debut with them all against a few years later against England at Kingston, and he's told he gets the news while he's playing. He's 17. He's playing street cricket with his mates, and someone runs over and says, "You've got to get to Jamaica. You've been selected for a Test match against West Indies." Like, you better get on the plane then. I thought, what a lovely little sort of snapshot of life. And he's picked as a number 9 to bowl left arm spin. I mean, it's incredible development. He gets 4 wickets, but Hutton gets a double 100, and England win and square the series 2-2. And then he moves up the order, and then 2 years later he scores 365 not out against Pakistan.
It's a nice touch that immediately following that on the front of part 2, there's a lovely portrait of Everton Weeks to begin the review section. To skip through a few of these, Emma John was your book reviewer this year, always a very important role. Of course, the gong that Geoff won a couple of years ago. And Daniel Melamed won the prize this year for This Is Cricket in the Spirit of the Game. And it was, as I understand, having not read the book based on Emma's write-up, essentially a series of photographs, which I suppose is unusual given what we normally expect from the Wisden Book of the Year.
Yeah, no, perhaps this isn't the time to admit I've not actually seen the book yet, but I trust Emma's judgment. I mean, her point was that it's essentially a beautiful coffee table book of photos of cricket down the years, and she said in last year of all years, it was an important sort of visual aid and a reminder of the game we were missing, and she said she felt quite emotional browsing through it. So I thought it was a intelligent choice for a different kind of year. And
I won't indulge too much in the media section written by Richard Hobson, but as always, there's a debate around the TMS cast and stuff like that. And there's a nice bit there about the Quarantine Cup. It includes my call of the final, which is pretty nice. And BBC returning to TV broadcasting for the first time since 1999. Of course, a lot of emphasis on what Sky were able to achieve around Black Lives Matter as well. The podcast section by James Gingell's inside of that, which includes more kind words about what we're doing here on The Final Word, which is lovely, and other projects that we've been involved in through the course of 2020, and social media, which rounds out that section via Dave Tickner, and that had to include a big emphasis on Mark Church's Garden Cricket. I mean, you're looking at Quarantine Cup, you're looking at all the different things that we're able to do, documentaries on podcasts and so on, and then Mark Church, who prevailed throughout the lockdown period, playing cricket with his garden furniture.
Yeah, madman, complete madman, and great copy for Dave. His obvious way into the piece. I mean, I think Church played out entire international series with his sort of deck chair and barbecue stand or something. Yeah, remarkable effort, really, but rather him than me, but good on him.
Then Brian Carpenter was looking after the blogs. He doesn't say it in as many words, but Neil Manthorpe, the best in the business as usual. Jack Chantry was doing the county retirements. You gave a special section for Shield Berry, former editor of the Wisden Almanack, who wrote about Ian Bell, of course, as Geoff pointed to before. The last link back to 2005. I love all the quirky bits as we get through this. You know, cricket and the law. There's a feature there on the Bournemouth man who was fined £10,000 after faking his MCC membership card in the pavilion. And there's a great little subheading here. England player records 100, which refers to when Ben Duckett lost his licence for driving at 106 miles per hour. So you get to, and your team, of course, get to have some fun with these subheadings as we work our way through the book.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of humorous side to Wisden's quite important. I mean, I think Matthew Engel probably takes credit for that as the editor who made Wisden sort of laugh at itself a bit more. So always plenty of that going on in cricket.
We're going to hit up Fraser Stewart again in a couple of weeks to keep pushing him on the inconsistency of the application of waist high no balls. But there he is this time talking about when Joe Root withdrew his declaration against South Africa all the way back in January 2020 before the pandemic. It feels like a million years ago having that reference point there. A far more important section, I suppose, in relation to the conversations we've had in the last 2 years, Lawrence, is the environment. Part of the book you introduced back in 2019 with Tanya Aldred, and interesting how she's come at this around the idea of what we've become more efficient with through COVID, especially with flying people around. I mean, cricket can be a crazy sport with how much we fly around, and maybe some of the lessons that we've learnt through 2020 can be applied in the future to make sure our game's more environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, she goes big on the air miles, which was always a subject she was going to address at some point. And last year, the fires in Australia kind of knocked that off the headline. But actually, she had to go for it this year, and because the flying was so down. The question is, will cricket adapt? I'm not entirely confident it will. The boards are just so frightened about earning money to stay alive that I don't think they're going to suddenly sort of start flying fewer people around. I mean, one of the obvious solutions you'd have thought would be to organise tours in a more sort of eco-friendly way, so that you're not zigzagging across India 5 times in a tour. You go in a loop, or you go for the shortest journey each time. But do we honestly think that BCCI give 2 hoots about that? All you can do is keep the pressure on.
You asked Gideon Haigh to write about the test documentary on Amazon, which was noteworthy given I think that this time last year, Lawrence, that's what we were all doing. We were all watching that. So Gideon was the right man for that commission. And then we get to the Obituaries passage, which was chunkier than it might otherwise have been, partially informed by COVID-19. So there's the greats of the game, like John Edrich, who of course passed away on Christmas Eve. But also, I like the fact that Scott Borthwick's grandmother gets a mention there as well. Margaret, or Nana, who was known for, among other things, the pies she would deliver to the press box. So I was just kind of curious about the approach you apply to that. Like, who gets a Wisden obituary? And it's a massive, massive section. How do you pull it together?
Yeah, it is massive. I reckon there are about 16 people we knew had died of COVID in the section. There may have been more, of course, and there may be 1 or 2 we missed. How do you pull it together? You just keep an eye out. We have a sort of network of spies around the world who will help us out. I mean, a guy called Warwick Franks in Australia helps us out with some of the Aussie obits. Gulu Ezekiel in India. There are people all over the place, but you do have to keep your eyes peeled. And sometimes the danger actually can be you write too much. You start to delve into some of these people's lives and you realise how rich they were, especially from the wartime era. We'll soon reach a point where no one fought in the Second World War anymore, and maybe the obits will feel a bit more bland because no one was sort of skiing down a mountain in Norway, escaping from the Nazis, and then taking 5 for 10 against Leicestershire a week later. We need more of those stories. But what you judge it on its merit. I mean, last year did feel like a biggish year. I mean, as you mentioned there at the end, John Edrich and then Robin Jackman died on Christmas Day. Someone like David Capel, Dean Jones, guys who go before their time. You feel like they need a big hit. They deserve it. They've gone well before we expected. So you just judge each one on its merits. That sounds like a boring Test batsman's answer, but that's how you do it.
Yeah, the photo of Dean Jones on Boxing Day at the MCG, batting in his baggy green, was especially powerful. Then once we get beyond that, we're kind of the almanac moves into its familiar form. English international cricket, English domestic cricket, overseas cricket, always worth reading Dan Brettig's piece on Australia. Likewise, Geoff's reports on the Australia-India series, the epic that played out through December and January. Franchise cricket, T20 cricket, Kieran Pollard is the T20 leading player in the world, according to Tim Wigmore, who wrote up that piece. Women's cricket with Mel Farrell at the front, writing the international summary. Then we're into the registers, records, and last but not least, part 9, one of my faves, the almanac, the actual almanac, where we get to the page. I suppose we're up to page 1200 before we arrive at that, Lawrence. And this year, in terms of errors that have been sent through to you, there is a belter. There is one from 1923, the edition where C.V. Leaf, it was said that his highest score for Forest School in 1922 was 277, and this year you've received correspondence saying it was actually 27. So some 98 years later, you get to correct the record. What a joy.
Yeah, so what, we added 250 runs to his highest. These things happen. He must have had a great time for the rest of his life, because he'd have said, I scored 277. No, you didn't. You scored Look it up in Wisden, mate. I don't remember the day that panning out that way, I have to admit, but fair enough. No, so those are great moments. We're not so keen on errors from the previous year's edition, because that's my fault. But we quite like ones from 1923, or what have I got here? 1943, Wisden 1943, the match between Surrey Home Guard and Sussex Home Guard appears to have taken place on August the 17th, 1942, not August the 18th. And why do they feel the need to write in? But Errata is a great page.
This is why we absolutely...
As long as it has passed the statute of limitations, then you want to know about it. As long as you can take no responsibility for it. Also, I'm surprised that nobody pointed out that it was interesting that Mr. Leaf was playing for the Forest School.
And then we get to the very end, which is the Index of Unusual Occurrences, which is the final page of the book, 1,248 pages later. You go back to note that on page 779, burglars stop play. On page 676, kites stop play. And last but not least, page 681, world's most famous cricketer mangled by President Trump. It felt like you made a point of putting that right at the very end of the book, Lawrence.
Yeah, it worked alphabetically, but yes, we did want to round it off with bid farewell to the great man. What did he say?
Virat Kohli.
Virat Kohli and Sachin Tendulkar.
It was magnificent, wasn't it? And in the stadium next to, I think Narendra Modi was on stage, wasn't he? In the stadium that was then shortly named after him. So two great men.
Big deep breath.
Don't mix politics and sport, Lawrence. Don't mix politics and sport.
Big deep breath. That is the Wisden Almanack of 2021, Lawrence. Again, it's an astonishing piece of work, produced in the toughest of circumstances, given everything else that was going on last year, everybody working remotely, of course, and all the rest of it. Congratulations on the achievement. It's such a brilliant read. You can access all of our offer codes for the Wisden Almanack in the show notes, which will pop down there, so you get a 30% discount on the pre-order if you're in Australia or the US, or if you can become a subscriber in the UK, and I think you get the book for 25 quid instead of 55, something like that. It's a fantastic deal. Lawrence, you're a wonderful guest, a great supporter of ours. Thanks for being part of what we do here on The Final Word.
Thanks for having me. Each year. This is my toughest Wisden interview, so I always get an early night and stay off the grog, and it's been as fun as it ever always is. So thank you.
I did want to ask you as a postscript, you also managed to have a baby daughter during the last year while producing this book, which felt like the greater achievement, or the bigger weight off your mind once it was done.
Well, the baby daughter was created, shall we say, before the pandemic kicked in, so I can't sort of claim all the credit for that. But yeah, she kept my feet on the ground. She showed. I sound like a cricketer here. She put everything into perspective for me, and she gets a mention. So her Wisden career starts this year in the preface.
Winnie's Wisden collection now extends to 2. I can hear her in the background. She's sick today, home from nursery, so I'm going to go and give her a cuddle and end our interview here. But I've now got the 2020 and 2021 editions for her, collecting from birth, which is the right way to do it. You can too. All that's in the show notes. And again, thanks to Lawrence Booth.
Great stuff. Take care, guys.
This is The Final Word with Geoff Lemon and Adam Collins, and thank you for that long span of his time, a decent percentage of his life. The Wisden of Editor's Almanack. The editor of Wisden Almanack, Lawrence, open inverted commas, photo, close inverted commas, Booth. He's done it again.
What greater incentive to buy the book either? The fact that we've got it all in the show notes, discount, the fact that we're working with the Almanack commercially at the moment, editorially talking to the boss of the bloody thing. Go get yourself a copy. It is. I've got 2 here at the moment in hard copy, which feels very special to have it in the hand. But it's also the longer, what do they call it? The shorter Wisden, which is an ebook. There's the digital edition. There's a number of ways you can get the Almanack and enjoy some of the best cricket writing in the world.
Mm-hmm. And also, Wisden is an anagram for Widens, if that's ever useful to you. So that I don't know why. I'm just offering that up. That's a bonus. That's for free. You don't even need to buy the book to get that, but you can buy the book very cheaply. Look in our recent show notes. We talked about Zoleo today, but we'll put the info in the show notes for this as well to get yourself a discount copy of the book. Now, sing us a song. You're the Bannerman. A segment that we like to come to at the end of shows at the moment, looking all the way back to the very first Test match in 1877, in which Charles Bannerman made a record 67.35% of his team's score. To be fair, everything that happened in that Test match was a record because they hadn't played Test matches before, but it remains a record to this day, a record that has stood the test of time. And so we like to look at innings, not in Test cricket necessarily, but anywhere in cricket, that have surpassed the Bannermanian threshold. And Adam, you have been looking through these this week.
I have. And the longer we do this segment, and we're going to keep it going for a while yet, because we get some great emails through and messages on the Patreon page, it reinforces to me how freakish that it's never been broken in Test cricket. Because it's happened quite a bit at first class level and happens all the time in recreational cricket. But Charles Bannerman stands head and shoulders above the rest on this measure. So I've got a beauty this week from Harold Combe, who is sent through. Would it be Harold Combe, the way it's spelt there, Geoff? How would you go?
I think so.
Harold Combe.
Yeah, I'd go like a Peter Combe, the great Australian children's songwriter of the 80s. Orange juice, belly flop in a pizza, etc. But take out one O, and so make the long double O sound into a single O sound. Apparently, the Wiggles said that Peter Combe. He walked that they might run. He paved the road for them to follow. So, thank you, Peter.
All right, so Howard brought to my attention an innings that is a great Bannerman, a 95%er. A 95%er, perhaps the biggest number we've seen so far. And it's from one of the greatest, most well-known players of all time. Perhaps not one of the greatest of all time, but had a great career over a very long period of time, Basil de Oliveira. Now, this goes back to when he was playing in South Africa in the non-whites competitions that they had in the segregated country as it was back then. And this is ultimately drove me back to his Guardian obituary, which explains an innings where he made 225 out of 237 with 16 sixes. So in the obituary, when he passed away in 2011, it reads, from an early age...
sixes?
Yeah. Yeah,
just my brain was expecting you to say 16 fours because you
No.
generally do the fours first, followed by the sixes. I was like, 16 fours and how many sixes? I was like, wait, you just said 16 sixes.
Yeah, I really did. So he was considered to be the best cricketer in the non-white leagues at the time in South Africa, unsurprisingly. And then he played this innings at age 21. He hit 7 sixes and 1 4 in 1 8-ball over. And he ended up
really choked.
No, sorry. I'm actually conflating. I'm conflating 2 innings. That when he's 21, he did that, where he hit 7 sixes and a 4. When he was 23, he made this 225 in 75 minutes. Mark Nicholas also writes about this in a long form piece that he wrote about Dolly on Cricinfo rather. I'd love to learn more about it, but I can't locate the scorecard. But yes, it's been noted in a number of places after Howard brought it to my attention. But a 75-minute innings where De Oliveira made 225 out of 237, 95% with 16 sixes. I mean,
it's better than 3 runs a minute. How many people have gone at better than 3 runs a minute?
Yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. So thank you, Howard, for bringing that to my attention. And we've got another stonking Bannerman on story time, which we will be recording later in the week for this Saturday, Geoff.
Do I know anything about this? Have I been?
If you've looked through the shared document, you may have seen it. I popped it in last night when doing our research. You might have a look at it on Saturday morning before we record.
I like to be surprised by these things. You know, I like to make sure that I come to it fresh, so that you can amaze me anew. So I will look forward to that. Story time. That's the show we do on the weekends where we get deeper into cricket history, even though we've spent a fair bit of time on it today. I think that's it for today.
It is.
For us. That has been The Final Word. Geoff Lemon, Adam Collins. Thank you to Lawrence Booth once again. Thanks to CBUS Super Annuation, who helps support the show. Thank you to the Zoleo, ZOLEO.com. Dave Collins edits the podcast. It's on the Bad Producer Podcast Network. They have other shows that you may also be interested in checking out if you like things like books and American football and comedy and other things that you may also enjoy. You're a well-rounded individual. Life's not all about cricket. It's not for us either. Storytime on the weekend, IPL shows on the YouTube channel. If you want to play Nerd Pledge, go to patreon.com/thefinalword. I think that's it.
I think it is as well. Yep, I think you've captured everything that we need to say. The last thing I might mention, if you haven't said it in a while, if you're using the Apple Podcast app and you wouldn't mind dropping us one of those 5-star reviews and a rating, I gather that helps with the algorithm. So, and there's other podcast programs where you can do similar things, but I think that for whatever reason, the Apple one carries the most weight.
The Al Gore rhythm. The rhythm of Al Gore, former vice president and mad salsa dancer. It's been The Final Word. We will see you next time you decide to watch or listen to one of our shows. Till then.
Bye.